Mid-July in the Rust Belt isn't merely a season, it is a sentence. It is a physical weight that presses you into the asphalt. A suffocating blanket of humidity that turns the air into something you have to chew before you can breathe. I remember that heat with a clarity that still makes my skin prickle. Even now, sitting here in the climate-controlled silence of my library, I was 32 years old then, a lifetime ago, and I was standing in the ruins of the only home I had ever known. It was a modest, crumbling bungalow at the end of a street where the pavement cracked like dry clay. My parents saw the people I believed, where my parents had passed within months of each other, leaving me with a legacy of debt and this dying house. I was renovating it to sell, driven by the desperate math of poverty. The air inside the house was stagnant, thick with the smell of wet plaster, ancient sawdust, and the peculiar sweet rot of trapped memories. Every breath tasted of grit. I had stripped the wallpaper in the hallway, revealing layers of history that peeled away like dead skin, but that afternoon, I was focused on the study. This room had been my father's sanctuary. It smelled of engine oil and cheap tobacco, a masculine scent that had once made me feel safe but now just smelled like absence. The floorboards near the radiator had rotted through, victims of a slow leak we hadn't been able to afford to fix. I was on my knees, a crowbar heavy in my gloved hand, acting as a surgeon to the house's decay. The soundscape was aggressed, the groan of the wood as I applied pressure, the sharp snap of rusted nails giving up their hold, and the relentless, droning buzz of a cicada clinging to the screen door. My shirt was soaked through, clinging to my back. Sweat ran into my eyes, stinging like salt water. I wedged the iron claw of the bar under the third plank from the wall. It resisted at first, the wood bowing under the force, before it splintered with a violence that echoed in the empty room. I leveraged it up, exposing the dark, joisted throat of the house. I expected to find nothing but mouse droppings, or perhaps the calcified remains of a long-dead bird. Instead, I heard the distinct, hollow thud of metal sliding against stone. I paused, the crowbar hanging loosely in my grip. The space between the joists was filled with gray insulation and dust bunnies the size of fists, but nestled deep in the corner. Resting on the plaster of the ceiling below was a box. It wasn't a treasure chest. It was a biscuit tin, the kind that usually holds sewing supplies, wrapped tightly in oilcloth that had grown stiff and brittle with age. I reached down. The air in the crawlspace was significantly cooler, damp and earthy. My fingers brushed the oilcloth, leaving streaks in the grime. I pulled it out, the weight surprising me. It felt dense, heavy, intentional. Sitting back on my heels, ignoring the protest of my knees, I unwrapped the cloth. The tin beneath was rusted at the seams, the once bright colors faded to a dull, bruised purple. I had to use the flat edge of a screwdriver to pry the lid open. It gave way with a screech of protesting metal that sounded like a scream cut short. The smell hit me first a sharp, acidic temps of vinegar mixed with the musty, library scent of decaying paper. Inside, there was money. Stacks of bills, bound in rubber bands that had long since snapped and turned to gum. They were old tenders, 20s and 50s from the 90s, to a woman drowning in funeral costs. It looked like salvation. But beneath the cash, resting at the very bottom like a foundation stone, was a single, folded document. My hands were trembling, not from the exertion, but from a sudden, unexplained chill that had nothing to do with the drafty floor. I unfolded the paper. The texture was heavy, official. An embossed seal caught the dim light filtering through the dirty window. It was a certificate of live birth. My eyes scanned the typed text. The typewriter ribbon ink slightly smudged on the ease. Name of child, Martha Elizabeth Vance. My name, date of birth, June 14, 1993. My birthday. Everything was correct. Mundane, even until my gaze drifted down to the parents' information. I blinked, waiting for the hallucination to pass. I expected to see Sarah Vance, the gentlewoman who had raised me on coupons and unconditional love, the woman whose hands were always rough from scrubbing other people's floors. But the name on the line for mother was not Sarah. The name typed in stark, unforgiving black ink was Alina Vance Holloway. The world didn't spin. It simply stopped. The silence in the room became a physical pressure, pressing against my ear. Alina, my mother's estranged sister. The ultra-wealthy socialite who lived in the gated estate 3 towns over. The woman who sent cold, impersonal checks and cards signed by her secretary. The woman who looked at me, on the rare occasions we met, as if I were a regrettable stain on a Persian carpet. I looked at the field for father. It contained a single word, unknown. I sat there on the floor of the dead house, the document shaking in my hand. The realization hit me physically, a punch to the gut that drove the breath from my lungs. I wasn't the daughter of a struggling mechanic and a waitress. I wasn't who I thought I was. I was the discarded secret of the town's most powerful dynasty. The silence of the empty house became deafening as the truth settled over me like a shroud. She hadn't just ignored me for 32 years. She hadn't just been cold. I whispered into the dusty air. She erased me. If she was my mother, then who was the woman I had buried last week, and why had she been paid to keep me? I did not drive immediately to the gated estate where Alina Van Soloway lived. Rage, when it is pure, requires a certain temperature to be useful, and mine was still too hot, too chaotic. I needed it to cool into something harder, something sharper. Instead, I drove to the only place where the truth might still be breathing, however faintly. The nursing home was called Sunnyvale, a name so aggressively cheerful it felt like a lie painted over the sign. It sat on the edge of the industrial district, a brick box where families stored the things they could no longer carry. I walked through the sliding glass doors, and the atmosphere changed instantly. The humidity of the July afternoon was severed by the aggressive, bone-deep chill of institutional air conditioning. The air here didn't smell like the rot of my father's study. It smelled of aggressive sanitation, industrial-strength lemon cleaner warring with the underlying, inescapable scent of boiled cabbage and human decline. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a headache-inducing frequency, casting everything in a flat, shadowless pallor that made the residents look like wax figures left out in the sun. I walked down the long corridor to room 304. My footsteps squeaked on the polished linoleum, a sound that felt irreverently loud in the quiet hallway. Sarah was sitting in the armchair by the window, staring out at the parking lot. At 58, she looked 80. Early onset dementia is a thief that doesn't just steal memories, it steals the person, hollowing them out until only the shell remains. She looked so small, the woman who had carried me on her shoulders, who had worked double shifts at the diner to buy me a prom dress, was now a fragile collection of bones wrapped in a knitted cardigan. I pulled the metal chair close to her knees. I didn't want to do this. I wanted to turn around, burn the birth certificate, and pretend the last hour hadn't happened. But the paper in my pocket felt heavy, like a stone dragging me to the bottom of a river. "Ma," I whispered. She turned her head slowly. Her eyes, milky and vague, drifted over my face. For a moment, there was nothing, just the empty static of a disconnected line. Then, a spark. A flicker of recognition that was almost painful to watch. "Marty," she rasped, her voice thin as parchment. "Did you bring the bread?" I took her hand. Her skin was paper-thin, translucent enough to show the map of blue veins beneath. "No bread today, Mom. I need to ask you something. It's important." I pulled the folded document from my pocket and smoothed it out on the beige blanket covering her lap. "Who am I, Sarah?" The use of her first name acted like a slap. She blinked, her gaze dropping to the paper. She didn't read it. I don't think she could focus on the letters anymore, but she recognized the seal. She recognized the lie. The reaction was immediate. She began to weep, not with the sobbing of an adult, but with the terrified, confused whimpering of a child who knows they are in trouble. "She didn't want you," Sarah mumbled, the words tumbling out, wet and broken. "She had the career, the politician husband. She said a baby would ruin her. It would ruin the image." "Alina," I pressed, gripping her hand tighter. "Alina is my mother. She paid for the house," Sarah whispered, her eyes squeezing shut. "She paid for your school. She said, if I took you, I had to make sure you never bothered her." The confession unlocked a door in my mind that I hadn't even known was bolted shut. The smell of the nursing home, that lemon bleach cocktail, suddenly vanished, replaced by a sensory memory so vivid it made me dizzy. I was 10 years old again. It was Christmas, but the air in our small kitchen was sweltering from the oven. There was a scent of pot roast heavy on the onions, rich and savory, clashing violently with a perfume that smelled of jasmine and cold, sharp alcohol. Alina was there. It was the only time she had ever come inside our house. I remembered her standing in the center of the linoleum floor, looking like a bird of paradise trapped in a chicken coop. She wore a dress of silver silk that seemed to shimmer with its own light, utterly out of place amongst our chipped formica counters. On in the memory, I had just run inside from the backyard. I had scraped my knee on the concrete, blood welling up dark and sticky against my skin. I was crying, looking for comfort. I saw the back of a woman with dark hair, my mother's hair, and I ran to her, wrapping my arms around her waist, burying my face in the silk. The reaction hadn't been a hug, it had been a flinch. It was a physical recoil, a spasm of revulsion, so violent it threw me off balance. Alina had spun around, peeling my small, dirty fingers off her dress as if I were a leech. I remembered looking up, expecting Sarah's warm eyes, and finding instead a gaze of pure, Arctic ice. She had dusted the spot where I touched her. Her face twisted in disgust. She didn't look at me. She looked over my head, directly at Sarah. "Keep your responsibilities under control, Sarah," Alina had said, her voice smooth and dangerous. "I'm not paying you to let it run wild. If it ruins this dress, I'm deducting it from your check." It. She had called me it. The memory faded, leaving me breathless in the sterile hospital room. I looked at Sarah, who was now rocking back and forth, humming a lullaby to herself. The anger I had felt earlier finally cooled. It hardened into a blade. The monthly checks, the help from the wealthy aunt. It wasn't charity. It was child support. It was a service fee. I wasn't a niece. I was a liability that had been outsourced to the lowest bidder. My entire life, my clothes, my food. The roof over my head had been funded by a woman who viewed me as a stain on her reputation. I stood up. Sarah didn't notice. I kissed her forehead, tasting the salt of her sweat, and whispered, "I'm going to fix this." I walked out of the nursing home and into the blinding heat of the parking lot. My car was a beat-up sedan with a rusting bumper and an air conditioner that only blew hot air. But as I turned the key, the engine roared to life with a satisfying growl. I drove out of the industrial district, away from the cracked pavement and the payday loan centers. I drove toward the hills in the west, where the roads widened and the trees grew tall and manicured. The birth certificate burned in my pocket, hot as a coal. I wasn't just driving to a house, I was driving to a reckoning. But as I approached the iron gates of the heights, seeing the security cameras pivot to track my rusted car, a single, terrifying thought struck me. If Alina had paid to keep me hidden for 32 years, what would she pay to make sure I stayed that way? The transition from the decaying industrial district to the enclave of the heights was not gradual, it was a border crossing. The air changed first. The heavy, exhaust-choked humidity of the town below was replaced by the crisp, manicured breeze of wealth-manufactured microclimate, where even the wind seemed to obey a zoning ordinance. I drove my rusted sedan through the open iron gates of the Holloway estate, the engine sputtering like a dying animal, a harsh, mechanical cough in a cathedral of silence. The estate was a sprawling expanse of green velvet lawns and white stone, imposing and utterly soulless. It was a fortress disguised as a home. As I parked on the pristine crushed gravel of the driveway, I saw that the machinery of high society was in full swing. A garden party was being erected with military precision. White tents rose from the lawn like silk mushrooms. A string quartet was warming up near the fountain, their discordance eerily matching the chaos in my own chest. Staff, in black waistcoats, moved like synchronized swimmers, carrying trays of crystal and silver. I stepped out of my car. I was still wearing my renovation clothes, jeans, stiff with drywall dust, a t-shirt stained with sweat and rust, and heavy work boots that looked like violent intruders against the polished limestone pavement. The catering staff paused as I walked past them. They looked at me, not with hostility, but with confusion, as if I were a ghost haunting the wrong century. I ignored them. I was not there to serve order. I was there to serve a warrant on the past. I found her in the cellar. It was a glass cathedral attached to the west wing, filled with the suffocating humid scent of orchids and damp earth. The light here was diffused, soft, and flattering. Alina stood by a long table, directing the arrangement of white lilies. She was perfect. Her hair was an architectural marvel of ice-blonde lacquer, her suit tailored to within an inch of its life. She looked less like a woman, and more like a statue carved from diamond, beautiful, sharp, and impenetrably hard. She heard the heavy thud of my boots on the tile and sighed without turning around. Her posture didn't shift. "Deliveries are in the back," she said, her voice cool and dismissive, waving a hand vaguely toward the service entrance. "And please tell your manager that if the ice sculpture is late, I will not be paying for it." The rage that had been a hot coal in my stomach suddenly flared into an inferno. I didn't speak. I walked up to the glass table, the surface cluttered with expensive vases and silk ribbons, and I slammed the rusted biscuit tin down. The sound was explosive, a harsh, metallic clang that shattered the polite tranquility of the room. The tin bounced, scattering white petals across the glass. Beside it, I slapped the birth certificate down like a gauntlet. Alina spun around. For a second, her face was a mask of irritation. But as her eyes landed on the rusted tin, the tin she had likely given to Sarah 30 years ago, the mask slipped, just for a fraction of a second. "I'm not a delivery," I said, my voice shaking, not with fear, but with the adrenaline of the kill. "I'm your daughter." The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized. The string quartet outside began to play Mozart, the cheerful melody filtering through the glass like a mockery. Elena looked at the tin, then at me. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning the dirt on my clothes with distaste. "Lower your voice," she hissed, glancing toward the open French doors. "Do you have any idea who is coming today? The governor is en route. I cannot have a scene. I don't care about your guests," I snapped, stepping into her personal space. The smell of her perfume, that same cold jasmine from my memory, hit me, triggering a wave of nausea. "I care that you sold me. You traded me like a used car for a seat on the charity board. You paid Sarah to be my jailer." Elena's expression hardened. The shock was gone, replaced by a vicious, steely She crossed her arms, looking at me not as a child she had abandoned, but as a business deal that had gone sour. "I gave you a life," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "You think I wanted a child at 22. I was in my second year of law school. I had a path. You were a mistake, Martha. A biological error in my timeline." The cruelty of the words took my breath away. She spoke of my existence as if it were a clerical error, a typo she had corrected with whiteout. "A mistake," I whispered. "I fixed it," she continued, her voice rising, sharp and defensive. "I gave you to Sarah. She was desperate for a baby. She couldn't have. I wanted a future. I wouldn't compromise. Everyone won. I funded your mediocre life. I kept a roof over your head. You should be thanking me, not tracking mud onto my limestone." She didn't apologize. There was no remorse, no hidden well of maternal longing. There was only the transaction. She walked over to her purse, sitting on a velvet chair, and pulled out a leather checkbook. The sound of the zipper was like a zipper on a body bag. "How much?" she asked, uncapping a gold Mont Blanc pen. "Is that hovel falling down? Do you want 10,000, 20? I will write you a check right now, and you will take your rusted tin and your self-righteous indignation, and you will go away. You don't fit here, Martha. You never did." She held the pen poised over the paper, waiting for my price. I looked at the checkbook. It was the ultimate insult. She truly believed that everything, even a human soul, had a sticker price. The realization washed over me, cold and clarifying. I had come here looking for a mother, or at least a reason. I found neither. I found a calculator in a silk suit. I reached out and took the checkbook from her hands. She smirked, thinking I had accepted the terms of surrender. I didn't. I ripped the check she had started writing in half. Then I ripped the page underneath. I tore the leather cover. I threw the shredded remains into the center of the white lily arrangement she had been perfecting. "I don't want your money," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the humidity of the room. "I just wanted to see if you had a heart. I wanted to see if there was anything inside you worth saving. Now I know why you gave me away." I leaned in close, until I could see the fine lines of cosmetic surgery around her eyes. "You don't have one." I turned on my heel, the rubber of my work boots squeaking on the tile. I walked toward the door, leaving her standing amidst the ruined flowers and the scattered confetti of her checkbook. I reached the handle, my hand trembling, ready to leave this toxic glass cage forever. "Martha," Elena's voice stopped me. It wasn't loud, but it had changed. The annoyance was gone. It was replaced by something far darker, something amused. I paused, my hand on the brass latch. "You think you're noble," she said softly, walking away from the money, "but you're forgetting something. If I'm your mother, did you ever stop to ask yourself who your father is?" I froze. "Sarah didn't tell you, did she?" Elena laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "She couldn't be caught if she told you his name. She knows you wouldn't survive the night." I didn't turn back. Elena's parting words that veiled threat about my father hung in the humid air of the solarium like a suspended guillotine blade. But I didn't stop to ask for clarification. At that moment, the identity of the man who had sired me mattered infinitely less than the identity of the woman who had raised me. I walked out of the glass cathedral, my boots echoing on the marble, and pushed through the heavy French doors back into the afternoon heat. The walk back to my car felt different. When I had arrived, I was storming a castle, fueled by the erratic energy of a woman who had lost her history. Now, As I crunched across the pristine white gravel of the driveway, I felt a strange, settling calm. It was the feeling of a fever finally breaking. The garden party was still in its setup phase, the string quartet was sawing through a waltz, and the catering staff were arranging silver platters of canapes. I walked past them, a ghost in drywall-dusted denim, but I didn't feel out of place anymore. I felt entirely separate. They were actors on a stage I had just exited. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the manicured lawn. The iron gates of the Holloway estate loomed ahead, black lace against the orange sky. As I drove my battered sedan through them, watching the security cameras pivot away from me, I felt the physical weight of the secret lift from my shoulders. It evaporated into the cooling evening air. I hadn't lost a mother in that solarium. You cannot lose something you never possessed. Instead, I had confirmed the one truth that actually mattered. I already had a mother, and she was waiting for me in room 304. The drive back to the bungalow was quiet. I turned off the radio. I needed the silence to process the architecture of the lie I had lived in. The landscape shifted from the manicured hedges of the heights back to the cracked sidewalks and leaning telephone poles of my neighborhood. But the poverty didn't look ugly to me tonight. It looked honest. When I stepped back into the house, the sun had fully set. The interior was shadowed, illuminated only by the street lamps filtering through the bare windows. I stood in the hallway, breathing in the scent of the renovation. Just hours ago, this air had choked me. It had smelled of rot, failure, and stagnation. Now, as I inhaled the mixture of sawdust, wet plaster, and old pine, it smelled different. It smelled like history. It smelled like work. It smelled like life. I walked into the living room, navigating by memory around the stacks of tiles and buckets of paint. I went to the mantelpiece, where I had stacked a few boxes of personal effects I'd saved from the purge. I dug through the cardboard until my fingers brushed the edges of an old photo album. The plastic cover was cracked, the pages yellowed and sticky with age. I flipped through it under the beam of my flashlight until I found it. It was a Polaroid from 1993. The image was grainy. The colors shifted toward magenta, but the narrative was clear. It was taken in this very living room. Sarah was sitting in the sway-backed armchair, holding a bundle of white blankets. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles bruised under her eyes. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, and she was wearing a stained, oversized t-shirt. But her face was illuminated by a terrifying, absolute love. She was looking down at me, as if I were the only source of light in the universe. In the background of the photo, near the door, was a blurred figure. It was Alina. She was wearing a sharp suit, her hand raised, checking her watch. Her body was angled toward the exit, one foot already out the door. I ran my thumb over the glossy surface of the photograph. The contrast was so stark it was almost comical. Biology is an accident. It is merely the successful collision of cells. But family is a deliberate, agonizing choice. Alina had provided the DNA, the raw architectural blueprints of my existence. But Sarah had provided the scraped knee kisses. She had cooked the midnight soups when I had the flu. She had worked double shifts to buy me braces. She had hugged me when I failed math, when I had my heart broken, when I felt small. Alina had birthed me, but Sarah had made me. I picked up the birth certificate from where I had tossed it on the table. The embossed seal caught the flashlight's beam. A part of me wanted to burn it. I wanted to take a match to the lie and watch Elena's name curl into ash. But I didn't. History, no matter how painful, shouldn't be destroyed. It should be filed. I found a cheap wooden frame I had bought at a dollar store years ago. I slid the document inside, smoothing the creases. I didn't hang it on the wall. I walked into the nursery, the room I was painting yellow. The room that was the reason I was fighting so hard to sell this house. I knelt down and placed the framed certificate on the very bottom shelf of the built-in closet, shoving it all the way to the back. I placed a heavy can of buttercup yellow paint in front of it, obscuring it completely. It was a fact. It would always be a fact. But it wasn't my truth. I stood up, wiping the dust from my knees. The house was silent, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the echoes of Sarah's love, a love that had been bought and paid for by a woman who didn't understand its value, but a love that had been given freely nonetheless. I walked to the window and looked out at the overgrown backyard, watching the fireflies dance in the tall grass. The threat about my father was still out there, a dark cloud on the horizon that I would eventually have to drive into, but not tonight. Tonight, I was the daughter of Sarah Vance, and that was enough to survive anything. She kept her perfect reputation, her money, and her cold, empty house. But as I painted the nursery yellow, ready for my own future, I realized the truth. She didn't give me away. She set me free. Secrets have a way of surfacing, don't they? If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to my channel. I have many more locked away in this library. Waiting for you.